So I've been wanting to share my creative process a little bit, or maybe the creative process kind of work in progress. It's not fully finished, but it's something I think about a lot just for myself as someone who likes to do personal creative work and projects. I think it's fascinating to take the time to really look at what's happening in your own mind, how you got from point A to B to Z, and the choices you made and the shifts you have to make in your mind sometimes to make the choices to move yourself along while you're doing creative work. This image that I've been working on pretty slowly, that's one thing I've had to shift about myself, is to not hurry up to get to a finished project and to just take your time and kind of see what comes to fruition. So this image is still in the middle of it, but it took me a long time to get to this idea, which I think is interesting because it was a mixture of allowing myself to think differently and to not be so pigeonholed in what I felt like something needed to be, and to get so narrow focused on what these underwater images are supposed to be. Because these underwater images first started off as in 2023 when I started this most recent batch of these images. The final editing looked like this, or like this image right here, and I was really happy with them. It was very fulfilling to start this project and to hone in my process for getting these images as the output. Yeah, I was absolutely thrilled with them. Actually, it was, it's one of those moments where you just are, I guess, really happy with where you ended up for your own creative thinking. And so I took a bunch of images, 2023, 2024, and got a decent body of work for myself that I was really proud of. And most of them ended up kind of looking like this. Like, this was where my filter was when I was combing through the images. This is what I was going for. The editing, just the style of it all. This is where I wanted to end up with them. And so I worked within that process for a while. And then it kind of got to a point where it felt a bit formulaic, like maybe I'd almost trapped myself within a defined way that this project needed to be. So it was almost exhausting. It kind of felt like when I wanted to create and wanted to produce something, I would just go back to this process to try to emulate the feeling that I got. And at least for me, that can feel a little taxing, almost forcing something out of yourself because it worked in the past, but maybe that's not what's working right now. Maybe that was what needed to happen to create this body of work, was that formula, that process. And then when you move a bit into the future and you try to, or I try to replicate it, and it's not generating the same outcome, same feelings, I start to get, I guess, maybe a little negative about it. Just like, what's happening? Why isn't this working? Like, what's changed? And then maybe it's realizing that creative process worked for that time frame and that moment, that flow state, but maybe it's time to transform, think of something different, view the images differently, maybe realizing that this was a complete thought, complete idea already, and maybe I didn't want to let it go, or like I said, it's kind of like trying to capture a feeling, and then once it's been captured, then that's kind of the complete idea right there. And so I definitely took a break from this because I found myself trying to rush to an end game, trying to rush to need to edit a photo, want to complete it, want to post it online, want to fulfill that feeling of creating something, the final product. But it was really nice to kind of take a break from from one big creative project and let it sit for a while to see how it changed. And I did go back to it earlier this year and got into the pool and took these images, but they weren't quite hitting the mark though. It wasn't, the editing is way different. The feel of them for me personally was not exactly what I was trying to capture. I found myself kind of looking at this batch of images, still trying to place that old process onto them of looking through a specific filter and trying to capture that same feeling from a few years ago and place it onto these. And that just caused a little bit more frustration for me, that why is this not ending up the way that it used to in the past? Why is this just not quite feel right? Why can't I quite get my editing? Why? Just all these questions. And it was kind of frustrating, super frustrating actually. And lately I've just been trying to, just in life in general, I've been trying to pay attention to subtle nudges, little clues of things that interest me, be more curious and be more open to changing up your own process and the way you think. And so I started paying more attention to this bigger feeling that these images create for me, that it feels like you're in a different world. This idea kept surfacing over and over again, that it felt like going through a portal, because sometimes the reflection and the surface of the water from underneath the water feels like you're coming through a portal, a different realm. And so I made the decision to kind of follow that urge of being like, okay, maybe these aren't just straight photos anymore of underwater self-portraits. Maybe I want to explore a different way of creating with them and go into different styles of editing, more photo manipulation, and maybe instead of just taking the photo just as is and editing it, I wanted to create something more with it, expand it out. Because I've always been interested in different styles of editing and photo manipulation. I tried that, or started working on that a couple years ago, and it wasn't quite it, but it was definitely the start and a step in a direction that I knew I wanted to go in, but maybe just wasn't the right time to explore that, or it was just curiosity, really. I mean, I definitely have a tendency to try to stay put and define myself too quickly, or define what I'm trying to do too quickly, which I think can stifle creativity. It's for myself, for sure, because I just like to explore lots of different styles. And so I took the time to take some space from this project yet again, so I wasn't trying to look at them through the same framework over and over and try to force it into something that wasn't working anymore. And so I ended up with following that idea of going through a portal, another realm, really enjoying the way how the water looks, like the ripples and the reflection, and seeing if I could try to capture a feeling again and go in a different direction. And I ended up, the first attempt was not that one, but it was this one. The first attempt at exploring something drastically different than I've done before was this image. And I don't think it's necessarily like, oh my gosh, wow, I'm super happy with this, but it was the fact that I allowed myself to change up my process was what the win was for this, was that this image checked off a bunch of boxes of things that I wanted to explore, but hadn't allowed myself to yet. I hadn't opened my mind up to the idea that I could drastically edit the colors and not just do a little bit more realistic, just underwater photo, that I could change it more into, I don't know what you would call this style. I don't, have a word for that, but I could change it more into almost like a graphic, I guess, or kind of makes me think of a painting in a way, and less of just like a photograph. And then throughout my editing process, I always enjoyed playing around with like rotating the image and coming from different angles, because underwater you have like the surface of the water and yourself under here, and it can look pretty surreal when you start rotating it and everything. But I'd never really allowed myself to do that because I thought maybe it was doing too much, trying to add too much to a simple photograph to try to make it something more. So that's what this image right here, I was allowing myself to play around with that, and then play around with more drastic color editing, because also throughout my editing process in Lightroom, when I was playing around with presets or just really adjusting the color in a different way, I found myself being really drawn to some of the more drastic changes, but it still wasn't quite the right time or the right fitting or the right image. It didn't quite sit right, but the detail of the enjoyment of seeing those drastic color changes was always there. And it was just like, I'm gonna kind of archive that idea in my mind and probably get back to it at some point, and it'll come to fruition, it'll surface, when it's ready. It's kind of how I operate. It's just like, maybe it's like not right now, but I definitely need to remember or realize that this subtle nudge is maybe pulling me into a different direction of some sort. So that's how I ended up on this image, was being like, oh, this is where I get to play around with some of those other different ideas that I've been wanting to. And it reignited that feeling again for me, the feeling that these images captured for me when I first did these 2023, 2024, of just like, whoa, this feels right. That's how it kind of felt when I landed on this image right here. Was like, oh, this feels right. This feels like the next steps I'd like to take just for myself to explore my own creative process and work on new skills and allow myself to expand past what I've been doing. Because a part of me has never really wanted to be finished with this underwater project, which is probably why I revisited it earlier this year, but I was still operating in an older framework of what I felt like it should be. But I always knew when I very first started this underwater project that it had some significance for me, personal significance of creative exploration, and that it'd probably lead me down a really neat path of exploration and thinking and editing and fulfillment. And so I edited this photo, like I said, was happy with all the check boxes that it kind of checked off for me, like opening my mind to exploring something different, thinking about these photos different, colors are different, how it's like a mirror image, it's not just the straight photograph, just how it kind of feels like diving into each other and sinking deep into this other world and from a different realm and portal. So I was really pleased that upon completion of this thought, it opened up a whole bunch of new doors for me of thinking. And I knew that this wasn't gonna be where I stopped at, because I do have a tendency to be like, oh, this is it, I'm gonna stay put right here, and been trying to practice letting go of that, and found myself realizing like, oh no, I think this is just like the first step into potentially what a new body of work could be. So I made this image, really pleased with it. Again, found myself, when I started working on this next image, trying to replicate it. When I remember when I went to be like, okay, I want to create another image kind of like in this style, I found myself again wanting to replicate that first image and kind of follow the path of how I got to it. And I ended up on this, which I ended up changing drastically, but this is kind of where it started, kind of emulating this image a bit, and wasn't quite happy with it. The composition, the flow, I knew it wasn't quite right. There's always that feeling of being like, I'm not quite sure what needs to be adjusted, but this isn't quite right. And then also practicing trying to slow down a bit with the creative process, not just hurry up to get to a final image. And so after looking at this for a while, I ended up on this. This was the final image that it ended up being. But it also took me a while to get to this, because when I composed this one, I kind of got stuck on this idea that, okay, these are the two images I want to use. Like, I need to make this work. Like, this needs to be how it ends up. And then getting to this image, it's almost like I had to let go of that first idea completely and be willing to completely just change things up, like erase things, take things away, completely change it to allow myself to get to this final idea. But I had to kind of realize what was nudging me to get into this direction. And I've always been really drawn to the way the material flows in the water, how it shows motion within the water, even though it's a still image. And then I love the way the water looks and the bubbles and the ripples, and then really drawn to the different style of editing. And so I'm not quite sure, I don't remember how long it took me to get from this image to here, but drastic difference. And it just took me sitting there and letting go of feeling like it needed to be a defined way, and letting go of old ways of thinking, letting go of trying to replicate what I did with this in order to get to this, and just keep exploring and be open to completely changing what you thought the original idea was. Surprising how hard that can be to like fight with yourself and your own ideas. It can be, it's interesting how you almost create these invisible rule sets to work within, and you have to literally fight yourself to unlock the new doors to get to where you're nudging yourself. And I think a big part of that was learning to slow down, because I totally got caught up in creating fast images, fast content. The formula works. I can put out an image, I can post it. Kind of got addicted to that process of just like, hurry up, need to produce more, need to do more. And once I realized like that wasn't really making me happy, and then also allowing myself to just work slower and really work on wanting to create a final finished product that I was really happy with, that also opened a bunch of doors to being like, you can take a whole month on a project if you want, or image. You can take your time until it feels perfect. You don't have to hurry up and get to the end project and the end image. So that helped a lot with my creative process. So this leads me to the current image that I'm working on, which is definitely in the middle of it. Not quite sure where this one's gonna go, because it's still, those other two images I'm very happy with them, but they still didn't quite hit the mark, and we'll see if this one does too, because there's still this idea in my head of wanting to capture a feeling of going through a portal, going through a different realm. My idea of this is kind of like sinking deep into your subconscious, unconscious exploration is kind of like a abstract theme. So how do I represent that? Because that's what this kind of feels like, is diving into yourself and wanting to continue to capture all those elements of enjoying the way the water looks and the ripples and the movement and the more unrealistic imagery versus just a straight photograph. But yeah, this image is taking me a little while to get to. This was what it started with, 3 images just placed together, and then I've slowly just been tweaking all the little details to make it blend together more. And it's been super interesting how just tiny little details can make such a difference with getting you closer to where you know you'll feel it's right. Because that's the other thing, is I tend to just kind of flow with where things are going. I have a loose idea of like a feeling I'm trying to capture, and I'll know when I've arrived, but I don't necessarily have a final end goal, end image of like it needs to specifically look like this. I'll know when I get there. And yeah, sometimes I'm not jealous, but sometimes I know some people can work where they have a final image in mind and they know exactly how to get there and then they create it. And I've never really worked like that. Maybe every so often, but lately I think I've allowed myself to sink more into like, oh, this is my process of, I have a general feeling that I'm trying to capture, and I'll just know when I've arrived. You'll just feel it by each choice you make, and letting go of feeling like it needs to be a certain way except for what you want it to be. So that's why I think it's fascinating to explore your own creative process, because it totally works hand in hand with other parts of your life, right? Just how you think throughout life, like not necessarily just with creative work. I think the creative process and creative exploration can help teach you a lot about yourself and just the way your mind works. And taking the time to think about what you're actually doing once you get out of, I guess, a flow state of just doing, and then taking a step back and observing your own creative process can be really transformative.